Welcome back. Glad to have folks here. This is our last class meeting before we have presentations. So I'll kind of like last time, have our meeting a little bit shorter today, just knowing that there is some extra time for you to get ready and start to prepare for your presentation next week. So today we'll be picking up where we left off in talking about how health and science is communicated to the public, including the way that our portrayals of health through media have had a pretty significant impact on how we understand a range of different topics, and also some of the challenges about how we engage in public efforts to be understood and educated on a range of health and science related issues. So last class, we talked about conveying health to the public, media's role, right? This idea that media is both friend and foe. It's a double-edged sword where media can both provide information and awareness that helps us to make better and more informed decisions. But at the same time, right, media can also be a source of bias, of misinformation, of perpetuating perhaps stereotypes related to health and science issues. So we also talked about how media constructs health images. We talked about things like body image and how media portrayals of what an ideal or healthy body is, particularly as thin, right, can contribute to lower self-esteem and behavior, especially among teenagers, that can have serious health repercussions. So Blake refers to the idea that we start to believe that media representation, whether it's fictional or not, represents real life. This was a term we talked about last class. They want to take a stab. Yeah, Angela? Yes, cultivation theory, right? Cultivation theory gets at the idea that the more and more we're exposed to media messages, regardless of whether or not those messages are actually true, the more we come to interpret and believe that it's true, right? I think back to a lot of the 2000s era, like spy and heist movies, right? Your like Ocean's 11 style movie. You typically have like a hacker character who's got like a beanie and wearing all black, and they start clacking on their computer and then they say, "I'm in," right? That's a trope that's been used so much to the point that a lot of people have a skewed perspective on what hacking actually means and how that works, right? In the same way, the way in which we depict media surrounding issues of mental health, of disability, has been so heavily reinforced and stereotyped that oftentimes it presents a distorted and skewed version of what that means, right? For instance, when a lot of people think about disability as it relates to developmental difference, right? Or particularly like portrayals of autism, right? Somebody says, "Oh, so you're like Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory," right? The way that specific images and representation of health and science issues are reinforced can change our perspectives, oftentimes in a way that's a bit distorted. So for today, I want to give some time for you all to continue to think about and prepare for your presentation next week. We'll also be talking about how mediated portrayals of health and science, including mental health and mental illness, have had a pretty significant and material impact on people with mental illness. And then we'll also talk a little bit about how to engage with public audiences and how we communicate about science to the public. So what I'd like you to do as we're starting out for today is to take some time to write on your own as part of your attendance for today what the population or group is that you have identified, as well as the health issue or topic that you've selected for your presentation, right? So it could be that you're focusing on elderly patients who have dealt with issues related to medical malpractice. That could be an example of two different issues that you put together. Once you've done that, think about what we've talked about so far about public and mediated communication. For this presentation, I'm asking you to think about the disparities, right, and inequalities that people experience related to health, but also some of the ways in which we can use communication to support and offset these challenges. If you have any remaining questions about this assignment, I'm happy to answer those too. So take some time to work on that. And then once you have finished and feel pretty good about this presentation side, I'd just like you to take some time to brainstorm examples of mental illness that you've seen portrayed in media, shows, movies, advertisements, social media, and so on. We'll give you some time to work through these. give you another minute or so to finish up here. People are wrapping up. Are there any questions that I can answer related to the presentation next week? So in working through this, we'll be going just sequentially as listed on Canvas on the presentation date. You'll have the 6 to 8 minutes. What I'll do is give you time signals. So I'll let you know. Basically, anywhere in the 6 to 8 minute is fine. But I'll let you know when you have 4 minutes remaining, 3, 2, 1. You, of course, are welcome to time yourself. You're also welcome to use your phone or another device to time yourself as you're working. You can use a phone. You could use a printout if you wanted to for your notes as you're working through the outline. Just make sure that you are getting both the outline and whatever slides or visual aids that you might be using to me prior to your presentation. And if you have any remaining questions on this, or you want to send me your outline or your rough draft or anything like that, I'm happy to look it over. I just recommend that you get that to me by Friday at the latest. And as a reminder, I'm upstairs in Ackerman. If you want to do an office hour appointment with me or meet with me through Zoom, I'll be available on Friday from 11 to 12:45 to meet with as well as you're working through this. All right. If questions come up later at any point, please let me know. I just wanted to give you some time to continue to think through this and to help to prepare for that presentation. All right. So what I want to do then is spend some time this class talking about some of these issues with mental health, mental illness, and also about communicating health and science to the public, right? So I want to start with the Stewart piece that I'm asking you to read this week, and then move on to our co-author piece related to health and science to the public. So the key thesis, and I think offering here that comes from the Stewart piece, is an examination of not only how mental health and mental illness is being depicted on screen, but also the impact that those representations can have on how we think about mental illness and related issues, right? Oftentimes when we think about media representation, we think, well, this is just kind of distorted, this isn't real, this is fictional, but it does end up actually having an interesting and I think tangible impact on the way we think about issues. And this isn't just, right, fictionalized media, it's also the way that we use sensationalized stories to talk about and discuss related issues. For example, right, Britney Spears, her conservatorship has generated a lot of discussion and larger conversations related to how ownership of and access to resources for people who might be dealing with mental illness and challenge is portrayed and talked about. But the ways in which media has depicting sort of her behavior, right, portrayed, she's shaved her head, she's acting erratic and strange, right? The usage of those kinds of headlines talking about her having a breakdown and similar kind of sensationalized stories about celebrity mental health are examples of the common depictions that we see in media. And I think that the Stewart piece offers some good insights into the consequences of these kinds of depictions. That oftentimes how we study media and how we study communication can help us to think about some of these challenges. So as part of the activity that I asked you to work on for today, I asked you to start to think about and brainstorm some examples of depictions of mental illness on media. And I want to kind of compile a list together of some examples. So feel free to either blurt it out, or you can raise your hand if you want to. Ideas and examples that you all started to think about as you were working through this prompt for today. Yeah, Garrett?
Johnny Depp and what he's going through.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so there's everything going on with Johnny Depp, Amber Heard, right? That whole case is getting a lot of attention and controversy, and how it's talking about sort of mental health and related issues. So that's a good contemporary example there. I don't know why Word isn't working, but I'll have this notepad here. What are some other examples? Yeah. Yeah. Right. So there's an interesting trend of like characters who are like, they don't have an official diagnosis on the show or movie, but like are oftentimes read or coded that way. One example is Benedict Cumberbatch's Sherlock, right? That kind of like precise, like mathematical focus on solving cases are examples of sort of this, how this superpower framing oftentimes creates unrealistic expectations. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So, I think that the depiction of sort of like unhinged or like mentally unwell characters as antagonists, as these like violent figures, are common. Joker is definitely one example of that. American Psycho, right? Even in the title, is an example of that too. Thinking about, just a lot of examples of that sort of element of characters, like something has gone wrong, like a character, like a villain origin story is that they're normal, but then something has happened. I might think about like the Green Goblin from Spider-Man, right? As this other character who has this scientific experiment and then suddenly they've become mentally deranged, right? Other examples. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. So the like level of scrutiny and focus that Simone Biles had in that decision, and sort of the backlash and response, and that what that tells us about thinking about mental health and related issues more broadly, I think is very important too. Mm, mm, right. So the way that it's portrayed in this kind of, like it's very distorted, right? That's definitely a challenge there. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I've been on a kick lately where we've been watching like the fictional like films, like biopic films about musicians, right? So there's one, there's of course there's Bohemian Rhapsody with Freddie Mercury. There's a one about Motley Crue, and then there's one we saw a really weird older one about the Doors, right? And a lot of the ways that these films portray these musicians as, they're incredibly brilliant, but they also have, this history of addiction, and they're portrayed as these larger than life figures, right? And it is kind of like it's okay that they have some issues with mental health or even abuse if they are talented, right? right? And that stereotype is did it? Mm-hmm. Right, right. And, I'm thinking about some of the ways specific, like situations or events in media sort of get used to constantly reinforce to talk about figures like Michael Jackson, right? Like the holding the baby out the window was constantly used to reinforce when talking about mental health and well-being, right? And I think too, right, we think about celebrities and we think about how not only they're under a microscope, but oftentimes they're put in that position from a very young age, and there's a lot of pressure and challenge that can come associated with that. Any others that folks thought about here? Yeah. Right, right, right. So, some examples I could think about are like, I think the film Black Swan depicted that, talking about, dance, ballet. There's also, there's like a lot of depictions of like mental health, addiction, and sort of some controversy surrounding those depictions in the show Euphoria on HBO, right? So there are a lot of examples that we could think about here, right? I think one of the interesting trends is that the representations are a lot more mixed, right? There's a bit more of a pushback against, somebody has a mental disorder and therefore they are evil or deranged, although sometimes we do see those depictions, right? There's some weird stuff going on in that Moon Knight show on Disney Plus with like multiple personalities for characters, right? There's also, right, some efforts to try to portray more nuanced approaches to addiction and related issues, but at the same time, we do see these tropes of things being romanticized or things being portrayed in a somewhat skewed way, right? So, there's some challenges there in terms of how we talk about and represent some of these related issues. I think these are some good examples here of current events and issues that relate to mental health and related issues that I think form a pretty good backdrop for what we are kind of exploring for today. Right, a couple of these were ones that you all already brought up, right? Kind of the serial killer, murdery type characters like Joker, right? 13 Reasons Why on Netflix has had some really kind of controversial and odd depictions of mental health and mental illness in a way that has definitely contributed to stigma and challenges, right? But again, this idea of media as both friend and foe means that we've also seen a really big rise in the use of TikTok and other forms of social media for people to talk about and address issues related to mental health. For example, folks with ADHD, there is a lot of content, like videos of people saying, how when you're dealing with this challenge, right, that makes content feel relatable and significant, especially to younger people, right? The vast majority of portrayals of mental illness historically, of course, have been very negative, although we've definitely seen some shifts in how those representations are unfolding, right? We also know that in this study, right, and this study was a ways back, it was in early to mid 2000s, so we've seen shifts since then, but 1 in 4 depictions of mental illness in media involved killing somebody else, right? Going at this psychopath, sociopath type of character. And at least half depicted people with mental illness as hurting other people, right? Which is a pretty distressing sign at this stage. And the rate of violence depicted among those with mental illnesses was much, much higher than those without, right? 30% compared to 3%. Reinforcing the idea that like if a character with a mental illness is introduced and talked about, that becomes like a plot point about that character and a source of potential danger, right? So I wanted to pull up a study that comes from social psychiatry and psychiatric epidemiology, which was addressing and sort of making a comparison here between how we see violence depicted on screen related to mental health versus the degree to which it actually is occurring in the world, right? Compared 2.9% of people with serious mental illness have committed violent acts, compared to 0.8% without, right? So the difference there is very small, right? And 10 people with both serious mental illness and substance abuse were more likely. However, I think that it's important to place in context that people without mental illness, but maybe with issues related to substance abuse, similarly would be placed at that higher. So mental illness is not like the deciding factor in any of those cases. But I think that the really interesting and important observation here is not necessarily having correlation mean causation, right? Just because two things are connected in space and time does not mean that one causes the other. In this case, just because there are slightly higher rates of violence reported among people with mental illness does not mean that mental illness causes violence. In fact, from the American Psychological Association, what has been found is that the explanation for this difference is not that mental illness causes one to be violent, but that there are external factors, things such as the safety of the neighborhood or community in which somebody lives, things like financial security, right? And access to resources, and so on, that are disproportionately worse for people with mental illness, right? People with mental illnesses are more likely to be poor, or less likely to receive quality health care in a lot of circumstances, or less likely to have access to stable employment, and so on. And those environmental and contextual factors and disparities have been found to be much better predictors of differences in violence, right? One of the most striking findings is an environmental one. When psychiatric patients without substance abuse were discharged from the same neighborhoods, the violence was about the same, right? So I think it reveals some important findings here. And I think another thing that's really useful to place into context here was a discussion that we had earlier in the term about stigma, right? Stigma being the negative social association that we give on issues of health. For instance, somebody is seen as disclosing or talking about being diagnosed with a mental health condition and is portrayed or treated as less supportive. That stigma and experience feeling socially isolated and unsupported can oftentimes lead to a more negative experience and negative health outcomes in a way that is completely independent of the actual condition that they're experiencing, right? So I think it's important to situate that contrast between the rates at which violence is depicted by media among those with mental illness versus the much more complex reality of disparities and challenges that are impacting those with mental illness. So, right, some of the ways in which people have been impacted by and affected by these negative depictions, according to the Stewart piece. First of all, this idea that heavy exposure to media depictions of mental illness reveals that people have more hostile attitudes. That is, the more people see media that depicts mental illness in a negative way, the more people are likely to openly be disrespectful, negative, or hurtful to people with mental illness, right? So there is a pretty direct relationship there, right? Another idea here is this presumption that mentally ill people are dangerous that can perpetuate at times a sort of preemptive attack, right? For instance, one of the challenges as we've talked about issues of law enforcement and police in the United States have been the ways in which police officers respond to people with mental illnesses and in terms of providing better training and resources in order to engage with that, right? Because somebody might be asking for help or yelling that can risk being misinterpreted as a sign of aggression. So sometimes, right, mentally ill people are more likely to experience violent crime or attacks under the belief that they are attacking somebody else when they're not. Another issue, right, is that mental illness treatment or resources are viewed more negatively due to ways in which media depict them, right? The idea here that treatment and support for mental illness does not mean a lobotomy, right? It does not mean something like shock treatment or something that is incredibly violent and intrusive, right? It's not like the Clockwork Orange holding the eyes open thing, right? But instead, that mental illness treatment and support can involve things such as medication, counseling, social support, and community that we don't necessarily see depicted in the same way. And also the idea that publics significantly overestimate violence from people who are mentally ill, right? Again, building on this idea that we misassume that mental illness means violence. Again, this is a case study and sort of an applied way for us to think about how a disconnect between media representation of an issue and actual populations affected by that issue have those real world consequences. So I think the thing that I find really distressing about how this study concludes and discusses the impact of these media representations are on folks with mental illnesses themselves, right? That some report that as a result of media depictions, family and friends treat them differently, right? And treat them worse on the basis of what they hear and what they see. They use as a reference point, well, I know that there's a character on a TV show who is bipolar and therefore you must be like that character. I'm going to stay away from you. Again, it creates this cyclical effect. Again, this idea of stigma, right, of being fearful of stigma, what happens when you out yourself or disclose something like a mental health or related condition might make you less motivated to share and talk about that condition with other people. In fact, a lot of folks with disabilities, including disabilities related to mental health and illness, find themselves in a really difficult position if they're applying for a job and they see that there's a field where they can indicate whether or not they have a disability, right? Oftentimes, people feel really conflicted on whether or not they should share and disclose that information to their employer because they know that potentially the stigma associated with it might make them less likely to be hired, right? We know that the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, in 1990 is designed to prevent discrimination on the basis of disability and provide reasonable accommodation, but there are a lot of loopholes and workarounds for that, right? If you have ever applied to or noticed a job that is asked if you can lift at least 30 pounds, and then you know the job itself does not involve lifting weight like that at all, lifting 30 pounds is used as a loophole to sort of circumvent the ADA, right? It means that if due to a disability you can't lift 50 pounds, people could actually discriminate you in the hiring process because you don't meet that job description without them breaking the law, right? So that can be an example. And also, people with mental illness blame media for sources of stigmatization. So there are a variety of solutions and measures that we can take to improve our own communication and to address some of the disparities and issues that come as a result of how issues of mental illness and health are portrayed. Pictured here on the right is one thing to think about, and that's the way in which we use mental health related metaphors to describe things, right? For instance, we have pretty definitively stopped using the R word to describe something that we don't like, right? Knowing that that has a history of stigmatizing. In thinking about this, right, it's a question of who or what you are comparing yourself to, right? If you're saying that somebody with a disability is inherently a bad person, and you're saying, I'm not like that, or that's really that person, right? Then what does that say to that person and how you think of them and treat them, right? So using language such as, I'm so OCD about this is an example of how we at times can perpetuate stigma, and that folks who actually have OCD might be not like that at all and feel a little bit trivialized by that comparison, right? You look so anorexic, right, might be another way in which that language gets utilized in a negative or hurtful way. Quit being a psycho, right, are examples of how we kind of trivialize and use language that can be hurtful, right? So again, as we've talked about, media is not just this negative entity in how it depicts and talks about issues of mental health, especially with the use of social media and the opportunities that it has. Media can provide more positive portrayals of mental illness, health, and related issues. There's a really interesting and I think pretty underrated show on Amazon Prime called Undone. That's an interesting case of a woman who is sort of dealing with issues related to memory and mental health, and sort of using, kind of creating this interesting tapestry of experience. Definitely worth looking into. The usage of real stories and examples to talk about mental illness is helpful, right? In fact, a lot of ad campaigns have involved, including regular people who are talking about disclosing and sharing challenges related to mental health. And those depictions have been really useful at helping people feel like they're not alone. And a focus on support needs and medication can also play a positive role, right? The idea that there's more representation of support, that mental health and mental illness are not things that mean the death of or lack of that person, but instead that kind of paralleling reality a little bit better, people with related conditions are dealing with an array of challenges and are actively seeking forms of support. So, you know, as I mentioned, there's a lot of interesting, I think, more nuanced or positive examples. I've used a lot of examples from like TV shows and film, but one thing I find interesting is also how interactive media, such as things like video games, can be used to portray issues related to mental health and well-being. One thing I find interesting about the use of like interactive media like games is that you are taking on, right, the role of a character, and in doing so, addressing some of the unique challenges that that character might be experiencing, or finding ways to represent yourself through that character, right? So there's a really interesting game that came out a couple of years ago. It was an indie game that was released, and the game was called Celeste, and the game featured a character who was climbing up a mountain, right? And at the same time, the character was dealing with an array of challenges related to depression, anxiety, and mental health related issues. I'm curious if there's anybody here who has played it or heard that one. Okay, yeah, awesome. So one thing I wanted to show that's an interesting example here of how I think mental health can be portrayed a little bit more positively is there's actually a section in this game where the main character, Celeste, is climbing up a mountain and she has a panic attack, right? And in the game, as you're like playing the game, and as you're playing the game, you're like being asked to time your movement to a feather that's going up and down to simulate breathing a little bit more slowly and trying to recenter yourself. And the thing that I find really interesting about this example is that there have been people who, after playing the game, who have dealt with anxiety and mental health related issues, think about the feather that's depicted in the game and actually have found improvement in their own challenges, panic and other concerns through that experience, right? Again, showing us some of the positive impacts that mental health and its portrayal can have. So just to show you an example here of how this is depicted on screen, right? So they're going up a mountain. The mountain has some problems, and she's freaking out. She's having this like panic attack, right? So if you're playing, you're lining up your controller and all of that to the feather to simulate the breathing. she calms down. So again, an interesting example here of how we've been utilizing media, including interactive media like games. I also find it interesting, right, that the friend that she's traveling with in this game is recognizing you're having a panic attack, here's how I can help you, right? So I think that over time we've seen a shift to having more sympathetic and thoughtful allies and supporters of people who are dealing with related challenges too. It's a way to push back against some of the issues with these representations. So I want to shift gears here to talk a little bit about the other article for today. So this was a piece that I worked on with some of my colleagues at the University of Utah. I was hoping to get some of them to attend. They weren't able to, but I did want to leave some photos that they took throughout that experience and talk a little bit about the process of working on this project. So I'm a part of a group, we're called Chemical Rhetoric, and we do a lot of work related to communication, rhetoric, and how we engage in understanding issues related to chemistry and other medical topics. So over the course of working together, we were really interested in this thing that was known as the National Historic Chemical Landmarks Program, NHCLP. And it was a program that was designed to designate locations in the United States, although there was actually a couple of places outside of the US that were known as chemical landmarks. That is, in the study and history of science, right, there were locations that were especially interesting or important to the development of chemistry and of science. And so they would be designated with this like ribbon cutting ceremony and plaque, right, that identified through the American Chemical Society a location that was especially important or significant to chemical history. For instance, the Joseph Priestley House, which was one such area in which there was the development of chemical research. There are some actual university buildings that had this, some old spaces like the Hull House, and even some like corporate offices, such as the old headquarters of Pfizer, right, which actually played a role in chemical history. And so we were really interested in this idea of what it means for something to be a landmark, and also the idea that we give something a plaque, right, we designate something as a landmark, an important part of history that we can go view and we can go see. So as part of this project, we traveled to some of these landmark locations. I tried to find one in Washington, D.C. and was not successful, but we were able to find a lot about how we educate and talk to the general public about issues related to health and science, right? And as part of that education and about part of how we communicate, the usage of things like place and space is really important. For instance, the way that we use museums, tours, interactive displays, and other ways of educating and thinking about these topics, I think is really interesting. So I wanted to touch a little bit about this and some of the ways that I think this adds to how we might think about health and science related issues. For fun, I wanted to show you what navigating this program looks like, right? So again, this comes through the American Chemical Society. They have this whole directory about all of these different landmarks. You can search it by year. They also can give you a visual map to look through that as well. They have a bunch in different states. Interestingly, they don't have any in Oregon, but they encourage you, if you don't have a landmark already in a particular state, to designate it. For instance, if you take a look at the Joseph Priestley example that I highlighted earlier, right? This is a landmark because this is actually the Priestley House that was located in Pennsylvania, was where oxygen was discovered, right? And so there's an interesting context, history about the contributions here, and the way that Joseph Priestley was able to develop and understand this a little bit better. So it's one example of a landmark. There's some interesting stuff here in the directory. Again, there's also this map that shows you the entire US and even a little bit outside of the US, and shows you where some of these landmarks are located, right? So there's this one in chemistry and medicine in Santa Clara. Here in Arkansas at Harding University, this chemistry collection. There's one here in Nebraska about Rachel Lloyd, right? There's a lot of interesting stuff about her too, in terms of her ability to provide research in Nebraska about the study of chemistry, health, and science, right? So there's some interesting stuff here in this program where it's just designating these physical locations and using those locations to try to educate us about the history and study of chemistry and science. There's also a timeline that goes through these sort of different discoveries and landmarks too. So we thought it was pretty interesting in terms of how we talk about history of science and health and all of those different things, and decided to use that for the analysis in our project. So, we were really concerned with how this project deployed and used narratives about science and health. So I want to touch on those just a little bit. Again, this idea of a landmark, right, was kind of two names. It was both a landmark discovery and a physical location. So one thing that I think is useful if we're thinking about how we communicate about science and health related issues to the public is about how we use a lot of different strategies to do so, right? As a lot of people in communication and rhetoric like to tell us, such as Kenneth Burke, right? Humans are storytelling. We love using and telling stories as a way of persuading each other and making each other understand it. In fact, Burke's idea of identification, that by providing relatable situations, characters, and stories we come to connect with and be convinced by one another, is a really kind of key idea in how we use communication and persuasion, right? The use of narrative storytelling to convey scientific knowledge to the public is a really interesting and important way that we talk about and engage in health and science issues. In fact, if we think about the most persuasive stories and language that have been used in talking about COVID-19, those have come from a lot of personal examples. For instance, people will use narratives to describe the experience of receiving a vaccine or testing positive for COVID and what that has done for them as a sort of rationale. Like you hear a friend, a relative, a partner talk about that experience and use that to make their own decision, right? Or a lot of the advertisements and sort of PR campaigns that have been designed related to vaccination will typically show a person who is making the decision and sharing a story about how they reached a decision on vaccination, right? So this idea then that using stories to convince us about a particular topic is especially compelling. So there's an interesting field in communication that's the study of space and place, right? If you've taken a class with me before, you might be familiar with these two, but just to kind of hit on this distinction here, right? Place is about significance and the meaning that we attach to a particular location, right? For instance, if there is a coffee shop that you and your friends love to go to, for instance, maybe you and your friends love to go to the local and sit around the fire in the evening, spend some time together after a long week, right? It's not just that is a physical location, right, that exists in town, but that the meaning and sort of context of that location, its significance, the place to hang out, to decompress, to have fun, is important and adds to the meaning of that area, right? So that's that idea of place, that it's not just about the geography, but it's about the meaning and significance that we attach to that area. Whereas space refers a little bit more to the physical matter and atoms of like a geographic and more physically bounded location, right? A coffee shop is a space, but what has happened there and the meaning that you have and your memories there contribute to this idea of place, right? So in our project, we were interested in exploring how we create place and we create meaning at particular locations. So one way that we educate about and talk about issues of science and health, right, to a broader public is through the use of what we call narrative framing, right? The idea that a physical location can be used as evidence for in a site in which storytelling happens. My old advisor was really interested in studying sort of places of public memory, and she did a project where she visited the Alcatraz Museum, right? And they do this really cool guided tour in Alcatraz where not only are you visiting the museum, but they'll give you a pair of headphones and they'll give you like an audio file to listen to as you're doing the tour that shows you the specific location of what's going on in the room, right? If you have been to like a museum that's very interactive, one of the things interesting about museums, about how museums are structured, is that they're very deliberate in how they're guiding you through and having you explore and understand the history. You can even think about this in a virtual context, right? Where we're getting a lot of our information online. We're using things such as websites to guide us through a tour of a place, right? The use of that location can be a way in which a story is told, right? What does a story tell us about what we do, right? So for the Hull House, for instance, there were a number of people who were involved in chemical history, including Rachel Lloyd, right? Who, if you read the plaque and you see this kind of landmark, they talk about how scientific discovery happened here. It was in these halls, it was at this desk, it was in this place, right? And so oftentimes, how we communicate to the public about science and related issues is by showing us those places and showing us sort of the meaning attached to those historical sites. Another idea here is that by us visiting and going to sites, we are proprietors. That is, we are co-owners and we are involved in science through our participation, right? Earlier in the term, I brought up the example of OMSI, right? The Oregon Museum of Science and Industry that's located in Portland. And OMSI is really interesting. I have fond memories of going there as a kid because it's so interactive. They had a whole exhibit where you would, they had a bunch of water and you would build little boats and see if you could get the boats to float in the water. They had an area in which there was like wind blowing and you were trying to stack some devices. There was a section where there was like a large, like you could shoot a large gust of wind and there were these little pinwheels on the other side, right? This idea that we understand science and history through our interaction with it, right? That science is happening all around us. We think back to, taking classes in science like chemistry, physics, biology, and classes you might be taking currently or exploring, right? The way that we learn about science and communicate about science to the public is through really highly interactive. We're doing a chemistry experiment. I remember in a middle school class, we built paper airplanes. And we actually used that as a way to learn about aerodynamics and some of the physics of movement, right? So this idea of learning about science and communicating about science through our ownership and participation is another crucial component. And then another interesting idea that came up for us was this idea that physical location can also kind of serve as a bit of a gatekeeper, right? So a year or two ago, I went to Washington, D.C., and as part of my trip, I was trying to find one of the landmarks, and it was called the Bakeliter, and it was used to develop a lot of synthetic materials that we now use currently, right? So I actually went to the Smithsonian Museum, and I was actually kind of looking through and trying to find the Bakeliter. Where's the Bakeliter? Where is it located? And so I was going all around this museum. I was kind of silly, right? Because I was like asking people who worked there where it was, and they were like, "What's the Bakeliter? I don't know what you're talking about." And so eventually I learned that it had actually been taken out of the gallery a few years ago. And so it was like in this random storage facility. And so it's interesting when we think about physical location and sort of the history of that location, that sometimes it isn't accessible, right? That what it means to understand and be educated about issues of science, health, oftentimes has this kind of gatekeeping function, that our ownership of and participation in a location is not necessarily equally available. What does it mean to be included? Well, sometimes the gatekeeping there plays a role, right? You had to have been there to have understood what's going on here. An example of that rhetorical appeal being used. So sometimes the way that we think about and understand our history and communicate about that history can be limited based on areas related to physical location. So what I'd like you to do is to take some time on your own to think a little bit about how physical location, place and space that we've been talking about so far in this class might impact how your communication could reduce health disparities. Remember, as part of your health disparities project, I'm asking you to not only think about the issue, but also think about what communication could support or offset the challenges that your population might be experiencing. About 2 more minutes. Think about this here. You might think about the location in which you're communicating to or campaigning toward a population, and how you might use or invoke physical space to support the needs of others. Most folks are about wrapped up here. So I'd like to hear from a couple people who have some ideas to share here about how they might use place and space in terms of reducing health disparities. Anybody who would like to share what came up to them, or yeah, Izzy?
So I was thinking like doing like drug and alcohol prevention for like young kids in like maybe college, but one thing I thought about like when I was doing the agency is if when kids are in school, they really don't want to hear like, oh, this is what you're supposed to do, stay away from this. So like it's not like the best place to give those messages, and that's why we have like the prevention programs like drug prevention and like public events to spread awareness.
Yeah. So thinking about context and mood, I think is really important, right? As you bring up, oftentimes like kids don't want to hear a lecture in school about not doing alcohol or that type of thing, right? They, if they are seeing those representations and messages in other places, that is probably a lot better, and also has a much bigger influence too, right? Having peers and colleagues who are talking about those things in other settings helps a lot. Other thoughts or ideas we're coming up with? Right. What did you notice or start to think about a little bit?
I did my topic on the access Indigenous people or American people have to healthcare.
Yeah.
And when you look into preservation in the communities, it seems like this would play a huge role. Just the stigma of being mentally ill within the community doesn't seem to be an issue for a lot of the people. It's not as prevalent as it should be. So I think just creating a space where it's acknowledged or it's talked about is not such a bad thing.
Yeah. Culture, plays a really big role there, in thinking about, first of all, how does a culture think about and portray mental illness? In fact, in a lot of like Indigenous cultures, sometimes it's not stigmatized in the same way. It might not be talked about, or it might be seen as people who have like unique insight or perspective on the world, right? And thinking about the physical space or location in which those conversations are happening is important too, right? Bringing in somebody from another culture into a background where somebody feels less familiar or comfortable or safe definitely plays a really big role in how they might respond to messages about health-related issues, right? Oftentimes, when we are going to the doctor and we're told about some of the health issues and measures we can take, we can trust the doctor or feel like they have some insights here, but we don't necessarily enjoy that encounter or find it especially relatable for us, right? It's a lot more persuasive for us to hear from a friend about a practice they're doing to stay healthy than it is to be like lectured by somebody working in a healthcare field about that topic too, right? So the role of persuasion and who is trying to persuade us and from where, I think is a really important consideration. So as you're developing and thinking about your presentation for this class, you might be thinking about the types of messages that work and can resonate well with the population that you might be speaking to, right? Kids and teens might not be persuaded by something like a school lecture in the same way that they would by meeting somebody like them or using, right, a more kind of entertainment education style of communication that shares this idea in a more interesting and engaging way. So these are important considerations here regarding how we make persuasive messages and use the different sites and spaces for those messages to happen. So I mentioned, we would wrap up a bit early today since I know that this is kind of the midterm week for a lot of you, and we'll have our presentations next week. And I want to give you some extra time to really prepare and to work on polishing those up as we gear up for those. So continuing our discussion from last class about how we talk about and address health issues to the public. We talked about some of the ways in which media portrayals have some really significant health impacts. Again, not only think about how mental health is oftentimes portrayed in unrealistic ways, but also some of the consequences of those portrayals as contributing factors to violence, to stigma, and to stereotypes. Thankfully, we are seeing some pushback against those things, but it's still an ongoing process. And the landmarks piece is kind of more of a fun example of the ways in which we use place and space and physicality in order to communicate about and share information about health and science to the public. So giving us some examples of how we educate and make populations aware about some of these issues. So our presentation day one will be coming up on Monday. So we'll have 7 presentations. Each of those will be 6 to 8 minutes. We'll have the chance to hear from everybody. Again, I ask that if you're not presenting on Monday, that you still come to class if you're able. I'll still be taking attendance for that day so that you can hear some of the projects and work that other people in the class are developing and see what is coming up in this project. So after we do those, I'll be talking about the final assignment of the class, which is an analysis of a health campaign. So we'll talk about that after next week. Again, if you're working through your presentation, you have questions or issues that have come up, please let me know, and I'm happy to help you in working through those things. So I hope that you have a great rest of your afternoon and a great weekend. Feel free to pass forward or email me your individual prompts from the day. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing our first round of presentations on Monday.